The night before June 6th, 1944, in the darkness of the English Channel, thousands of soldiers wait in silence, their hearts pounding beneath steel helmets. The sound of waves crashing against the sides of landing craft mixes with whispered prayers. Every man knows that at dawn they will storm the beaches of Normandy and face the full fury of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. History remembers their courage, the gunfire, the chaos, the sacrifice. But what history often forgets are the shadows that moved silently behind enemy lines long before the first shot was fired. In the small towns of occupied France, in cafes, farmhouses and hidden attics, women lived a double life. By day they seemed ordinary, nurses, mothers, shopkeepers. By night they carried secret messages tucked inside loaves of bread, mapped German defenses under the gaze of enemy patrols, and cut railway lines that would strangle the Reich's reinforcements. Their weapons were not tanks or rifles, but whispers, disguises, and unbreakable courage. The beaches of Normandy could not have been won without them. Yet their names, 7 remarkable women, were nearly lost to the silence of history. How did these women, risking everything, help turn the tide of the greatest invasion the world has ever seen? And why were their stories buried for so long? This is the hidden side of D-Day, the story of the forgotten figures, whose shadows shaped victory. The roads of occupied France were quiet at night, but never safe. German patrols lurked at every corner, their flashlights slicing through the darkness, their rifles ready to fire at the faintest sign of movement. It was on these very roads that André Borel, a young Frenchwoman with an unshakable will, made her stand against tyranny not with bullets, but with a bicycle and a bundle of secrets hidden in her bag. André was just 20 when the Germans overran her homeland. She could have remained silent, blending into the background as so many were forced to do. But silence wasn't in her nature. Recruited into the resistance, she became a courier, a messenger whose very life depended on her ability to slip through the cracks of occupation. Every journey she made carried with it the weight of life and death, not just for herself, but for every Allied soldier who relied on the intelligence she ferried. Imagine the scene, a cobblestoned road glistening under moonlight, her bicycle tires whispering against the stones as she rode through villages occupied by the enemy. In the wicker basket, beneath a layer of bread and cheese, were maps detailing German troop movements, coded notes that could alter entire battle plans, and messages written in invisible ink. To a German officer, she was nothing more than a young woman returning home after visiting family. To the resistance, she was a lifeline. The Gestapo knew couriers existed, and they were merciless in hunting them down. Roadblocks were frequent. Soldiers stopped passers-by at random, demanding papers, searching belongings, and dragging the suspicious into the shadows, never to be seen again. For André, each checkpoint was a silent battlefield. Her disguise was her weapon. Sometimes a factory worker, sometimes a farmhand, sometimes just another face in the crowd. She wore fear like a cloak, but never let it control her. The trick was to appear too ordinary to notice. There was one night that tested every ounce of her courage. Carrying a coded map intended for London, she approached a German roadblock. Floodlights lit the road like day, soldiers barking orders as they rummaged through carts and wagons. Her bicycle slowed as she approached, her heart hammering in her chest. If they opened her basket, if they looked beneath the bread, she was finished. Torture, execution. She knew the fate of those who were caught. But as one soldier waved her forward, his attention drawn to another man's cart, she forced her legs to keep pedaling, her face calm, her body steady. She passed through the blockade without a second glance. Only when the darkness swallowed her again did she allow herself to breathe. André's missions were not glamorous. They were grueling, exhausting, and filled with danger. She would ride for hours through back roads and forests, memorizing escape routes, using the cover of night to slip unseen past German patrols. On one occasion, she delivered word of a hidden German ammunition depot, a piece of intelligence that led to its destruction in a daring Allied air raid. Each message she carried, each map she delivered, carved a hole in the Nazi war machine. Her bravery did not go unnoticed. When the Special Operations Executive in Britain learned of her skills, she was recruited for even greater tasks. By then, her reputation was already spreading in whispers across occupied France. La petite Andrée, she never misses. For the resistance, she was a symbol of hope. For the Germans, an invisible ghost, but ghosts can only remain unseen for so long. As the tide of war grew heavier, so too did the danger. With D-Day approaching, the need for accurate intelligence reached its peak. Every courier run became more urgent, every checkpoint more deadly. Andrée knew the risks. She had seen comrades disappear, heard stories of men and women broken under Gestapo torture. Yet she kept going, because every successful delivery meant another chance for the Allies to strike, another chance for freedom to rise from the ashes. Her bicycle wheels turned like clockwork, each rotation a quiet rebellion against occupation. She was not armed with rifles or grenades, but with something far more dangerous to the Nazi regime: information. The armies that would storm Normandy needed more than bravery and bullets. They needed to know where to strike, when to move, how to win. Andrée Borel made sure they did. Her life was a constant tightrope walk between normalcy and death, between invisibility and discovery. One wrong turn, one suspicious glance, one unlucky night, and her story could have ended in a prison cell or worse. But she never faltered, never missed a delivery, never allowed fear to silence her mission. When the morning of D-Day finally came, the beaches were drenched in chaos, fire, and sacrifice. But behind that storm of steel and sand was the quiet work of a young woman on a bicycle, pedaling through the night with a basket of secrets. The men charging ashore may never have known her name, but their survival depended on her unseen courage. Andrée Borel had done her part. But for her, the war was far from over, and the shadows she moved in were about to grow darker. The night sky above France was clear, the moon spilling pale light over darkened fields. From the belly of a British aircraft, a figure leapt into the void, parachute blooming against the stars. Her name was Violette Sabo, just 22 years old, a widow, and now one of Britain's most daring special operations executive agents. She was not a soldier by training, but she carried within her the fury of loss and the fire of defiance. Her husband, a French Foreign Legion officer, had been killed in North Africa. With his death, she made a vow: if she could not grieve in peace, she would fight in war. On the ground, Violette moved quickly, her parachute hidden, her mission clear. She was to sabotage German railways, cut communications, and help lead the resistance in disrupting the flow of reinforcements. Every bridge she blew up, every train she derailed, bought the Allies more time. And time, in those crucial months before D-Day, was everything. Her courage was matched only by her nerve. Disguised as a farm girl, she carried explosives hidden in baskets, smiling politely at German soldiers as she cycled past their checkpoints. Hours later, those same soldiers would find rail lines twisted into mangled steel, locomotives burning, and convoys trapped in chaos. Violette was always gone by then, melting back into the countryside like a shadow. But sabotage was never without risk. One mission demanded she and her comrades ambush a German convoy carrying supplies toward Normandy. It was suicide work. The roads were crawling with enemy troops, the trucks armored and heavily guarded. Yet Violette insisted on leading. As the vehicles rolled into a narrow lane lined with trees, she signaled the resistance fighters. Grenades erupted, tearing through steel. Gunfire cracked in the night. The convoy halted, crippled, its cargo destroyed. In the confusion, Violette's voice rang out, urging the fighters forward, pushing the attack with fearless intensity. It was the kind of boldness that terrified her enemies and inspired everyone around her. For the Germans, each attack was more than an inconvenience. It was a chokehold. Supplies meant for the front were delayed or destroyed, reinforcements stranded, communications shattered. And every delay weakened their grip when the Allies finally landed in Normandy. Violette knew this. Each explosion, each act of sabotage wasn't just resistance, it was preparation for liberation. Her missions required precision. She learned to wire explosives in silence, to time detonations with deadly accuracy. She cut telephone lines in the dead of night, leaving German outposts isolated. On one occasion, she narrowly escaped detection when a patrol stumbled across her group just after they'd blown up a section of track. The Germans searched with dogs and rifles, but Violette slipped through a field, crawling through mud until the danger passed. It was survival by inches, by breaths held too long, by sheer willpower. Her comrades spoke of her resolve, but also of her humanity. Between missions, she laughed, she teased, she lit up the shadows with the energy of someone too young to be burdened with war. Yet beneath that brightness was a simmering rage, a woman who had lost her husband, her future, and would stop at nothing to ensure that others might win theirs back. The closer D-Day drew, the more daring her missions became. The Allies needed every distraction, every delay, every fracture in the Nazi defenses. And Violette delivered, but the risks escalated with each operation, and the Gestapo was watching. They knew someone, some phantom, was orchestrating chaos in occupied France. Patrols increased, checkpoints tightened, and the net began to close. One summer day, while traveling with fellow resistance fighters, she encountered a German roadblock. Heavily armed soldiers stood waiting, searching every vehicle, every passenger. She carried with her critical information, intelligence that could not fall into enemy hands. She knew the price of being caught, torture, interrogation, execution. And yet, she faced the danger head-on. When the first shots rang out, she returned fire, holding the line with a ferocity that stunned even hardened resistance fighters. For hours, she fought, refusing to yield, giving her comrades time to escape. It was in that moment, crouched behind cover, bullets slicing through the air, that Violette Szabó's courage blazed brightest. She was not fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the invasion she knew was coming, for the soldiers preparing across the Channel, for a France that deserved freedom. When the guns finally fell silent, the Germans had taken her, but they had not broken her. Even in captivity, even under the crushing weight of interrogation, she gave nothing away. Her silence protected the resistance networks. Her sacrifice preserved the plans for Normandy, and so, though she would never live to see the beaches stormed, her courage lived on in every soldier who set foot on French soil that June. The Germans had underestimated her. They had expected fear but found fire. Violette Szabó was more than a saboteur. She was a storm behind the storm, a force of courage that tore through the German war machine before the Allies ever reached Normandy. And like so many of the women who fought in the shadows, her story was nearly erased. But her fire was not the only one burning. In the prisons and camps of Europe, another woman was about to prove that not even torture could silence the resistance. The train that carried Odette Sansom back into occupied France rattled through the night, its windows blacked out, its passengers silent. To anyone watching, she was just another Frenchwoman returning home, clutching her travel papers, her face pale with the fatigue of war. But hidden within her belongings were secrets, coded instructions, contacts, the fragile threads of a network that could tip the balance of an invasion still months away. She was not simply a passenger. She was a weapon. Born in France but living in Britain when the war erupted, Odette had seemed an unlikely candidate for espionage. A mother of three, soft-spoken with no military training. Yet when the Special Operations Executive asked for volunteers who knew France well, she stepped forward. It was not adventure she sought, but duty, a conviction that if she did nothing, her homeland might never breathe free again. Her missions required nerves of steel. By day, she moved through towns occupied by German troops, her appearance carefully ordinary, her gaze lowered. By night, she slipped into back rooms where radios hummed with coded transmissions. She smuggled photographs of German fortifications, memorized troop movements, and carried microfilm so tiny it could be hidden in a button. Each piece of intelligence made its way across the Channel, into the hands of Allied planners who were sketching the blueprint of D-Day. The Gestapo knew the SOE was sending agents, and their net was tightening. In cafes, whispers travelled of arrests, of spies caught with forged papers, of men and women who vanished into the maw of the Reich. Odette moved cautiously, but the risk was always present. One slip, one unlucky glance, and her work would end in chains. That moment came in 1943. Betrayed by an informant, Odette and her commanding officer were seized by the Gestapo. The world she had navigated with such precision collapsed in an instant. They stripped her of her freedom, but what they wanted was far worse. The names of her contacts, the locations of safe houses, the veins and arteries of the resistance itself. If she spoke, entire networks would be obliterated. At first, the interrogations were subtle, questions, threats, promises of leniency. She gave them nothing. Then came the fire. The Gestapo beat her, burned her with red-hot irons, twisted her body until she could no longer stand. Every scream she stifled was a message to her comrades. She would not break. In the silence between sessions, she told herself that pain was temporary, but betrayal would be eternal. She clung to that belief as her only shield. When torture failed, they sent her north to Ravensbrück, the notorious concentration camp for women. The gates loomed like the jaws of some monstrous beast, and inside, the cruelty was unrelenting. Hunger gnawed at her. Disease stalked every barrack. Guards treated the prisoners as less than human, reminding them daily that death was only a command away. Yet even here, Odette's will remained unbroken. She whispered encouragement to fellow prisoners, passed fragments of hope where she could, and guarded the secrets of the resistance with a ferocity that astonished even her captors. It would have been easy to surrender, to accept that one life weighed less than the crushing machinery of war. But Odette refused. She knew that silence, her silence, was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Every day she endured without breaking was another day the Allied networks survived. Another day closer to the moment when Normandy's beaches would be filled, not with shadows, but with liberators. Her captors tried one final trick. They told her the Allies had abandoned her, that Britain had written her off, that she was suffering for nothing. But Odette understood the game. She had played with fire too long to be deceived now. She stared at them, defiant, broken in body but not in spirit. When liberation finally came and Ravensbrück fell, Odette emerged scarred but alive. She had given nothing away. The networks she protected had endured. The intelligence she once carried in whispers and codes had flowed into the Allied war effort, fueling the storm that broke across Normandy. Her endurance became legend. The Gestapo could shatter her body, but they could not bend her will. She had walked through fire and emerged unburned, carrying with her the proof that the human spirit, when anchored in duty, could resist even the greatest cruelty. For the soldiers storming the beaches, her sacrifice was invisible, her name unknown. Yet without her silence, their path might have been far darker, their landing far bloodier. Odette Sansom was more than a spy. She was a shield, one that absorbed the fire of the enemy so that others could fight on. And while she endured her torment in silence elsewhere in France, another woman was striking blows not with information, but with cunning disguises and smuggled secrets that would keep Allied pilots alive for the battles to come. In the occupied streets of northern France, life appeared deceptively ordinary. Shops opened each morning, markets bustled with chatter, children played in the narrow lanes. To the German soldiers stationed there, the war seemed distant in those moments, their presence routine, unchallenged. But beneath this mask of normalcy, a quiet rebellion stirred. At the heart of it was a woman few would have suspected. A baker's wife, a mother, a neighbor, who greeted the patrols with a polite nod. Her name was Suzanne Traversy, and behind her gentle smile, she ran a network that funneled secrets and saved lives. Suzanne understood the power of invisibility. While uniformed men drew attention, while armed partisans risked open battles, she built her war in the shadows. Her kitchen became a hub of resistance. The smell of fresh bread masked more than yeast and flour. It hid coded messages, maps rolled tight inside crusty loaves, even forged documents smuggled across checkpoints. A basket of bread carried through town seemed harmless enough, and that was precisely her advantage. But bread was only one of her disguises. She crafted hiding places out of the ordinary, turning toys into carriers of war. A doll's hollow body concealed rolled blueprints of German fortifications. A wooden train, set smuggled across the countryside, carried scraps of paper marked with coded routes. German soldiers, amused by the sight of a mother with children, never suspected that the innocent playthings clutched in small hands were loaded with intelligence destined for London. Her work extended beyond documents. Suzanne was a lifeline for Allied airmen shot down over occupied France. Pilots who fell into her orbit were clothed, fed, and disguised as farmhands or laborers. She taught them how to walk with the weary posture of peasants, how to avoid the gaze of soldiers, how to stay alive until they could be smuggled out along escape lines. Many of those men would later return to the skies, flying missions that shielded the Normandy landings. Each one owed his life to her courage. The risks were immense. The Gestapo had grown increasingly ruthless, aware that ordinary women were carrying extraordinary secrets. House-to-house searches became common. Soldiers tore through kitchens, overturned furniture, dragged men into the streets. Suzanne had to think faster, hide deeper. Once with German boots pounding on her doorstep, she shoved maps into the flour sack and plunged her arms inside, kneading the dough as if nothing were amiss. When the soldiers barged in, they found nothing but a flustered housewife, dusted in white powder. They left, and Suzanne exhaled, her hands trembling but her face composed. There were nights when she escorted pilots under the cover of darkness, guiding them through fields and forests to safe houses further along the escape chain. Each journey was a gamble. Patrol dogs prowled the countryside, and searchlights swept across the land like accusing eyes. One wrong step, one flicker of hesitation, and the entire group could be lost. Yet Suzanne walked with unflinching calm, whispering reassurances, steadying men who had faced combat but now quaked at the thought of capture. Her home became more than a sanctuary. It was a beacon of trust. Resistance fighters knew they could pass through her kitchen door and find shelter, food, and a plan forward. Pilots knew that if they reached Suzanne, their chances of survival soared. She stitched together a web of escape routes so intricate that even the Gestapo struggled to unravel it. But danger never slept. Once a German officer lingered at her stall in the marketplace, his eyes narrowing at the oddly heavy loaves she sold. Her pulse raced, but she forced a smile, broke a loaf in half, and offered him a piece. The officer laughed, chewed, and moved on. What he never knew was that the next basket she carried out of town held the intelligence that would guide Allied bombers to a critical German supply depot. Suzanne's war was fought with cunning, not gunfire. She was a strategist in an apron, a saboteur hidden in plain sight. And as the calendar moved toward June 1944, her work became more urgent. The Allies needed air superiority, needed every pilot they could return to the fight, needed every scrap of intelligence to know where the Germans kept their defenses. Suzanne delivered again and again, her quiet defiance shaping the skies that would one day darken with Allied planes. When D-Day arrived, countless pilots who had once huddled in her kitchen or walked the secret paths she guided now flew overhead, strafing German positions, clearing the way for the landings. Each bomb they dropped, each tank they destroyed, carried with it the invisible hand of the woman who had once hidden them in barns and smuggled their maps in bread. The soldiers on the beaches would never know her name, but their survival was bound to her courage. She had fought without medals, without uniform, but with a defiance so sharp it cut through the silence of occupation. And though she risked discovery every day, Suzanne Traversy pressed on, because she knew the fight was bigger than herself. She was one thread in a vast, unseen web of resistance, and within that web, others were carrying the burden too, women whose weapons were not loaves of bread or toys, but radios that pulsed with danger, broadcasting hope across the airwaves, while German trucks prowled the night. hunting for the signal that could never be silenced. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of a hidden radio. Inside a shuttered farmhouse on the outskirts of Tours, Yvonne Roudela sat hunched over her wireless set, fingers flying across the keys. Dots and dashes spilled into the air, Morse code carrying secrets that could decide battles hundreds of miles away. Each transmission pulsed into the darkness like a beacon, invisible to the eye, but deadly in its risk. She knew that every second she broadcast, German detection trucks prowled the streets, triangulating the source of the signal. If they caught her, there would be no mercy. Yvonne was no hardened soldier when the war began. She was a woman in her 40s, working an ordinary life in London. But when the call came for agents fluent in French, she volunteered. The SOE trained her not only in sabotage and disguise, but in the most dangerous skill of all, operating a wireless. Radios were the lifeline of the resistance, connecting isolated fighters in occupied France with the planners in London. Without them, D-Day's orchestrated chaos would have unraveled. Her code name was Jacqueline. Under that name, she became a ghost, a voice that the Allies relied upon, but no German could catch, at least not yet. Her work was unrelenting. In dimly lit attics, in barns that smelled of hay and dust, she tapped out reports on German troop movements, railway schedules, and munitions depots. She relayed drop zones where Allied planes could parachute weapons and explosives to the resistance. She even transmitted coordinates for bombing raids, watching the night sky hours later as distant flashes confirmed that her signals had hit their mark. Every message she sent tightened the noose around the occupiers, but every transmission carried its own ticking clock. German vans equipped with radio detection gear crisscrossed the countryside, their antennas searching for signals. It was said that an operator had no more than 20 minutes before detection locked onto their position. Yvonne lived in those 20-minute windows, her nerves straining with each click of the key. She would send her message, pack her equipment in seconds, and vanish into the night before the hunters closed in. There was one night when the risk pressed so close it nearly broke her. She was transmitting from a farmhouse when the resistance lookout burst in, his face pale. A detection truck was already moving down the lane, its headlights sweeping across the hedgerows. The signal was hot, too hot. She had minutes at most. She yanked the plug, grabbed the set, and bolted through the back door into the fields. The night air was sharp against her face as she stumbled through the mud, clutching the radio to her chest. Behind her, engines roared, boots hit the ground, voices shouted in German. She didn't dare breathe until she was deep in the woods, the set still safe, the signal silenced just in time. Yvonne's work came at a cost. The constant stress gnawed at her health. Sleepless nights, endless relocations, the weight of secrecy. Yet she pressed on because she knew the stakes. Without her broadcasts, Allied planes would drop supplies blindly. Without her signals, resistance attacks would scatter without purpose. She was the thread tying together an invisible army. Her courage did not go unnoticed. London praised her precision, her reliability. Fighters in the field trusted her with their lives. But the Gestapo was patient, relentless. They knew the voice on the radio was somewhere nearby, and they would not stop until they silenced her. In 1943, her luck began to fray. Moving through a town under false papers, she was stopped at a checkpoint. Something about her story failed to convince the soldiers. She was arrested, her equipment discovered, her identity exposed. The woman who had outpaced detection trucks for months was finally caught not by her signals, but by human suspicion. Imprisoned, Yvonne endured harsh interrogations, yet she gave little away. The Germans could strip her of her freedom, but not of her resolve. She had already done what mattered. Her signals had guided countless missions, coordinated supply drops, and weakened the German response in the months leading to D-Day. Her voice, carried in beeps across the ether, had reached far further than chains could bind. By the time the Allies stormed the beaches, her work had long since shifted the odds. German reinforcements that might have crushed the invasion were slowed, disrupted, or destroyed. Thanks to the coordination her signals had made possible, Yvonne Roudellar's war ended in captivity, but her story endures in the unseen threads she wove into the tapestry of victory. She was one of the first women SOE sent into France, and she proved that even in silence, even under crushing danger, undetermined voice could shape the outcome of history. The soldiers on Normandy's sands never saw her face, never heard her name, but they advanced under skies cleared by her signals, on roads softened by sabotage she helped direct. She had defied the silence of occupation with the hum of her radio, and in doing so became one of the hidden architects of liberation. And yet, even as she vanished into German custody, others remained free. Women who fought not with signals or maps, but with the courage to endure when all else was lost. Their battlefields were not attics or fields, but the very edge of survival itself, where memory, honor, and legacy would carry the war into its final, unshakable chapter. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the tide at Normandy ran red. Thousands of young men waded ashore under a storm of fire, their helmets glinting wet beneath the grey sky, their bodies pressed low against the sand. The world remembers their bravery, the soldiers who charged forward through chaos, the ships that thundered offshore, the planes that rumbled overhead. Yet long before the first boots struck the beaches, another army had been fighting, unseen and unheard. Their weapons were whispers, codes, baskets of bread, wireless signals carried by the air. Their battlefield was not the shore, but the shadows. The 7 women whose stories thread through this history were among those shadows. Each had carried the war on her shoulders in silence, long before the great invasion gave the world hope. Vera Atkins, the orchestrator, guided them into occupied France with an iron will and quiet grief, sending others where she could not follow. Nancy Wake struck like a storm, her defiance so fierce the Gestapo called her the White Mouse and hunted her in vain. Violette Sabo, so young and unyielding, fought in the hedgerows with a gun in her hands, buying precious hours with her life. Odette Sansom endured Ravensbrück's horrors, her body broken, but her spirit unbending, refusing to betray the web of resistance. Suzanne Traversy wove her rebellion into bread and toys, smuggling pilots and secrets past the occupiers' eyes. Yvonne Roudellar tapped out signals that pierced the silence of France, guiding bombs, drops, and armies through a channel of invisible light. Together, they were the scaffolding upon which the great invasion stood. Without their courage, the guns at Normandy might have been ready. Reinforcements might have reached the beaches faster. Allied pilots might never have flown again. Each woman, in her own way, helped loosen the stones of the German fortress, so that, on that June morning, the wall could finally crack. Their sacrifices were not without cost. Some never returned. Captured, tortured, executed, their bodies lost to the dark chambers of the Reich. Others came home haunted, carrying scars that silence could never hide. Yet even in death or in grief they triumphed. For their work lived on in the freedom carved out of the French soil, in the tides that carried armies to liberation. On the beaches that morning, as soldiers pressed forward under the hail of machine guns, they marched not alone. They marched with the strength of women who had already cleared paths in secret, who had already crippled supply lines, who had already lit the flame of resistance in the heart of occupied France. D-Day is remembered as a clash of armies, but it was also the sum of shadows. Victory was not just won by those who stormed the shore. It was secured by those who whispered in back rooms, who disguised maps in loaves of bread, who tapped keys in the dead of night, who endured unspeakable cruelty so that others might advance. The sands of Normandy tell one part of the story. The other part lies in hidden fields, in safe houses, in prison cells, in the coded pages of history. It lies in the courage of women whose names may not appear in the headlines of that day, but whose defiance shaped its outcome. As the tide receded from the bloodied shore, the legacies of these women remained, etched into the fabric of freedom. Their courage was quiet but unbreakable, their service invisible but irreplaceable. They remind us that history is not only made by armies, but by individuals who dare to resist, even when the world seems lost. D-Day was won not only by steel and fire, but by shadows, whispers, and forgotten courage. And in that truth, their memory endures, forever part of the tide that turned the war.